is still the better racket sport player. But since he doesn't play pickleball anymore, hard to. I've got the gold. I've got the actual title. I don't know what you have, pal. Don't hold it up. That means nothing to me. Hello and welcome back to the Bo and KO show. I'm KO.
I'm Bo.
And today we want to welcome to the pod an old friend and a former Bo podcast partner of mine.
Well, I was going to say, I actually remember, I think I was either in school or I had just gotten out of at a Long Beach State, and you said, hey, my buddy Thatcher and I are doing this podcast thing. This was, again, you guys were ahead of your time, but I do remember listening to you guys talk about whether it was the adult school or sports or, whatever you guys were interested in. I was one of the first listeners or loyal listeners.
Yeah, we had 3 great episodes. Of course, I'm talking about my good friend Thatcher Weldon. In addition to being a notable educator, specifically in adult education and ESL, that's professionally what he does. Thatcher, you are a former tennis player and coach and a current star on the Pop Tennis Circuit Bakersfield edition. Is that correct?
Yes, I'm one of the top pop tennis players north of the Grapevine. So, yes.
And south of San Luis Obispo, so a pretty large swath. Is that what you're telling me?
Well, no, I think it's south of – I don't think there is any south. It's just north of the Grapevine. Just north of the Grapevine.
Now, I have to give Thatcher a lot of credit here, Bo, because he was solely responsible for introducing me to pickleball back in 2017. We were both working at the PG Adult School and had become friends. And one day we were sitting in our classroom kind of discussing sports, mostly betting, because if you don't know, Thatcher's like this addicted gambling sports guy, specifically in fantasy. If you can't get involved with Thatcher unless there's some sort of money involved with fantasy sports. And then he asked me one day if I'd ever heard or played pickleball, to which I said, what the hell is that? Is that correct, Thatcher?
Yeah, and I didn't realize it was 2017. I thought it was before that, but yeah, that was when we were just kind of hanging out and discussing sports. And I remembered this short court racket game we used to play when I was coaching tennis, and where we would all get together and we would have 2-on-2 doubles on the net court, just the nets or the service boxes. And we would play to 5 points. First to 5 points lost, so you got a point every time you missed a point. And we played that, and I just remembered how much fun it was. And I started remembering paddle tennis, which I mistook for pickleball at the time. And so I was asking you about pickleball, and that's how we got into that.
Well, yes, if you fast forward now 3 years later, I am a national champion in the 3-5, 30-plus division of doubles. Wow. And Thatcher, you've won exactly how many gold medals in pickleball?
One. I've won one.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Was that in a Bakersfield event, or was that at something like,
I don't remember. I think it was national. I don't know. Let me get the
And it took, for the audience, it took Kenny about 3 minutes to brag about himself. That's a new record for the Bo and KO show. Oh,
yeah. Look at that. Look at that.
Gold medal.
Oh, wow. I'm proud of you, Thatcher. I can't even begin to bring out all my medals. They would weigh down my neck so far that you wouldn't see me on screen. Okay. Oh, before we get into pickleball and pop tennis, let's discuss and jump into the first part of our podcast here, and that's the state of racket sports in general in America. I think there's this perception that tennis is dying. And I researched this. According to the Tennis Industry Association, the TIA of America, last year we actually saw an increase in participation of nearly 1% to 17.8 million people in the United States. And when I get into the numbers, Thatcher, you're going to see that dwarves every other racket. Like, it's more than any other racket sport combined. Sure. But it is a little bit, okay. I think it's surprising to me, Thatcher, to see those numbers in terms of increase, because tennis really has been on this kind of decades-long decline in popularity. Would you say that its peak, which was estimated in the 70s to be 35 million. Would you say that's the peak, do you think?
I mean, I think so. That was before me. I know in the 90s, it was still really popular here in the U.S. when you had Sampras and Agassi going at it, and there were dominant American men playing. After that, I think is when it just really started becoming less and less popular in the U.S. when there weren't Americans competing.
Right, and I think the thing that we'll probably have to delineate here is that tennis in the terms of like professional and paying attention to the stars and all that versus how many people are participating in it. So if the peak, according to these numbers, is 1970s is like 35 million, and today we have 18 million, that's about half of what it was 40 years ago. Clearly that's a decline. I mean, there's no other way to put it. You've lost almost half as many people are playing, and it's not like the population as a whole has gone down, but has gone up. However, I also want to drill down these numbers, Bo, for you too, okay? Because I think we need to like kind of define. There's a difference between like a casual player, somebody who might play once or twice. It's kind of like in golf, right? The casual player who might play once or twice a year versus what they define as core players who play more than 21 times a year. And even under those definitions, Thatcher, that's less than 2 times a month. Then there are the kind of the hardcore ones. How often do you play, Thatcher?
Well, I pop tennis now at least twice a week. So, and when I was playing tennis, probably every day, 5 times a week at least, we were playing. Yeah.
And Bo, you have some experience with tennis, do you not?
Yeah, I grew up in a tennis family. My grandpa was an avid tennis player. When I lived in college for a semester, before I went and lived abroad for a year, I lived with my grandpa and we played about 3 times a week. And I think you do get that subset of the culture that is playing often. And I was getting lessons and have, kind of some fundamental skill in tennis, which has transferred over for me to pickleball. When I look at this, and kind of a question I wanted to bring to Thatcher that's adjacent to what Kenny was talking about is we know some reasons, some barriers of entry for people, whether it be price. If you want to be good at it, you need lessons, you need the right equipment, you need to be updating those things. You need your racket, restrung. You need to make sure you have, the best grip tape or whatever's comfortable for you. I also think the difficulty of it, when I go out with my friends sometimes and we play around, and I know some ground strokes and some basic fundamentals, but if they don't, the balls are flying all over the court, and it's almost frustrating to play. My girlfriend's a lot better player than I am, and I know I piss her off because I can't hit the ball just directly back to her all the time. Sometimes it's going one way or the other. What are maybe some other barriers of entry? Because like Kenny said, there has been this almost cut in half decline of people getting out on the court.
So I think you bring up a good point. You said you used to play with your grandfather a lot, right? I think that's how a lot of people play consistently is they have a brother or a sister or sibling or father, and they go out. That's how we played all the time. My dad, my brother, and I would be out there playing together. And then we would have some friends during the summertime that we would get together with and play. But you have to have somebody who's at a similar level. Otherwise, it's completely boring, right? Like you said. And if you can't play tennis constantly, like at least twice a week, I'd say, it's hard to keep your skill level up, your timing. And when I go out, even though I play pop tennis, which has similar, fundamentals, strokes, everything, it's really tough when you get the stringing, the racket with strings and all that. It's the timing, the overhead serve is hard. Yeah. So
I could never get the pop. The pop that you get on a really good ground stroke, I'm just kind of all over the place. I just learned for me to be good is I would cut shots and I would just play at the net and try and use athleticism there. And I think that is maybe when we talk about, and I know Kenny's going to get into this, is when we talk about pop tennis, which I had no idea about until, we planned this podcast and I went on YouTube and watched some and I was like, this is actually the type of tennis I could be okay at. And especially with pickleball, learning that from Kenny, I think that maybe is going to eliminate some of those barriers for people to start to understand the game a little bit more.
Right. And you bring up a good point too about where people kind of settle at a skill level, right? Like, because when you're playing high school tennis and you're just chopping the ball and coming in and using your athleticism, you can beat players who are actually working on their game and their ground strokes and working on serve and volley and strategy. So those type of players that just kind of get the ball back, they'll win a lot at that level, but they'll never get any better. So that's a good point.
So talking about those core players, right, defined as 21 or more times a year, okay? Of the 18 million that we say play tennis in America, only half of those are actually defined as core players, okay? And it got me thinking, is this just an American issue? Because when I went and then researched sort of the international or global look at it, there are 87 million players who play tennis globally. And surprisingly, if you think about the size of countries population-wise, right, you would say, well, the United States has to have the most players, right? I mean, you can't compare us in terms of total numbers to, say, Great Britain or France or Spain. They might have a lot of people playing as a percentage of their population, but in terms of total numbers, they're still going to be smaller than ours. And it's true. We still are the second most played. We're the second country with the most players. But I think the surprising number to me was that China had 22.5 million players playing tennis. And it's only surprising because the ITF, the International Tennis Federation, also broke it down by the availability of tennis courts and tennis clubs. And China doesn't even make like the top 20 on any of those lists, yet they have 22.5 million players. So I think I'm wondering, I'm throwing all these numbers out here because I'm starting to think that it's really just an American perception that globally tennis is still a huge sport.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's incredibly popular around the world, and I think also one of the things Americans, we're not as our sports are more localized. We like rooting for our home team, whereas tennis is more of an international sport. You find a lot of these countries that enjoy World Cup, right? They get really behind their tennis players for their countries and really excited about it. And so with China, I know that there was a former women's player who won a couple Grand Slams, and I would imagine that boosted the popularity in tennis, and that's why you're seeing such large numbers there as well.
I heard a lot of numbers there, Kenny, and the one that got to me is, God damn, China's just beating us in everything now. Beating us in tennis. Who would have thought? I mean, they're not beating us in freedom, but they're beating us in
right.
In
and I want to clarify a couple things too. This was just in terms of the people playing, and it didn't break it down by core players. And it makes sense that China has the world's the most populous country in the world. So I could see how that number would exist. I think it was just interesting because they still don't have a lot of availability. And so despite that, people are still playing. But I think the other thing about the American perception of tennis, and again, let's not kid ourselves, right? It shows up on SportsCenter, the majors and the Grand Slam events. Those things are all still big time sports. There's a lot of money still for tennis stars. But I think the big switch really is the United States is the only country where more females than males play tennis. And I think that also coincides with the fact that we haven't had a male Grand Slam winner. I mean, who do you think was the last person, male American, to win a Grand Slam event?
Was it Roddick?
Yeah. What year?
05?
03. I mean, so you're talking about a 17-year drought, and maybe you'd say 16 years because this year's kind of a wacky year. Where on the flip side of that, obviously for women's, it's almost like it's at its peak for tennis, at least in terms of America, because you have Serena and you have Venus, and you've just got this great dominance. I just found it, interesting. I also thought that, well, maybe the reason we've had such a drought in terms of winners on the Grand Slam is because of the 64 events since Andy Roddick won his U.S. Open. 58 of them have been won by 3 people, right? So, and none of them are Americans. So I guess maybe that's part of it, I would say. Are you surprised at all, though, Thatcher, with the amount of people playing tennis, just on sheer numbers, that are the males part of it is not as dominant anymore for America?
No, I'm not surprised. Our best athletes don't play tennis here in this country, right? So I've coached tennis at the high school level, and I really enjoy it. But a lot of times the best athletes are going to play basketball, football, baseball, right? And they just don't get into tennis anymore, and that's a huge part of it. Bo?
Yeah, I agree. I didn't play tennis in high school. I played basketball. I ran track, and it just wasn't a huge emphasis at PG High. We had some kids who grew up playing tennis. We had a couple kids who came actually from France and played on the tennis team, and they were very good. But that's just a part of that culture and a part of where these kids are coming from, and certainly the private schools are going to have better tennis team because that's more of the emphasis maybe for some of those kids or some of those families. And I think, we're not getting kind of like soccer, right? Where there's athletes that could do it and there's people that could be great at tennis, but the emphasis of playing those sports at a younger age, and it goes back to that barrier or those barriers that are kind of put up by some of these sports that maybe you don't get the best athletes, and that's why you don't get the popularity. You get the rarities of, the Williams sisters who again embraced a lot of the cultural aspects and the sports identity and the race identity as a part of their brand. But you're not getting that on the male level yet. I'm sure, and hopefully there'll be, some male tennis players from America that come out and can compete, but it is going to be a struggle to get to that level of the next Nadal or the next Federer when it's not really embedded in our culture too much.
Yeah.
I wanted to touch base real quick with the part about the availability, because unlike, say, I think it's a perception thing, I guess, is what I'm trying to get at, in the sense that certainly tennis probably has that perception of being like a country club sport like golf, right? It's kind of an elitist. It's kind of something that's done casually at country clubs and in private clubs. And yet I would absolutely differentiate that only in the sense that I think there are so many public tennis courts, so many unused public tennis courts. There may not be as many tennis courts as, say, basketball courts, but there's a lot of availability for tennis. So it's less about whether you have the ability to get out and play tennis, don't you think, more so than, say, obviously golf?
Yeah, I was going to bring that up too, because in North America, we're one of the few places, U.S. and Canada, where we have public tennis courts so available to people. You go to Asia, you go to different parts of the world, and most of the courts are not free to play on. You've got to pay some type of fee. I remember when I was in South Korea, even the public courts, they're kept up by like tennis clubs, so you have to pay a fee to play on them. So that's a good point.
And I'm going to save some of this discussion about courts for the pickleball discussion, because that's one of the quote unquote ongoing controversies between tennis and pickleball. And I'm wondering, Thatcher, and again, we'll save this for later, but keep in the back of your mind, do you guys have the same controversy between pop and regular tennis too? Because, that's always the big sort of, and I think racket sports in general ought to really look at each other as one helping the other instead of as adversaries. But we'll save that. Let's switch gears slightly and let's talk about pop tennis, okay? I think for many people, including Bo up until yesterday, myself really up until a few months ago when you and I were having a couple discussions, Thatcher, tell us, what is pop tennis and how different is it from regular tennis? How different is it from pickleball?
So pop tennis is very similar to tennis, same scoring. You've got the point scoring, love, 15, 30, 40 game. You play to 6 in a set. You use a pop tennis paddle. It's a little bit bigger than a pickleball paddle. So here's one right here. And you use a green dot tennis ball, which is a developmental tennis ball for youth, which is, unpressurized. So it has less pressure than a regular tennis ball. So it's the same sport pretty much, but on a smaller court, lower net, and with underhand serve. So there's no overhead serve. Yeah. So it's a little bit easier. It's a great developmental game for tennis, for kids learning, because it's the same strokes that you'd play in tennis. You want to get in and volley. So it's just a lot of fun. And it's a fast-paced game. Yeah.
Go ahead, Bo.
And I feel like that's, in my research of it, very brief research for the pod, is what Thatcher just said is important, because if you're trying to get people into tennis, and I think that's the goal, kind of like we talked about on an earlier golf podcast, is get more people into the sport, is that pop tennis translates a lot more into developing those skills for tennis than pickleball does. I think of pickleball almost as, a tennis adjacent, where pop tennis is really leading into and developing those skills to become a better tennis player, because you're using, the same type of ball. You're not using a wiffle ball. You're using, a lot of those same strokes. You're serving underhand, but a lot of times when you're rallying with friends, you might hit it underhand to start. So it's translating a lot of those skills, which I think is a benefit for pop tennis, maybe over pickleball.
Definitely. Yeah. And like you said, tennis can be intimidating for people just starting out. And when you're just, shooting balls all over the court, over the fence, it's not fun, right? It can be extremely boring. So pop tennis can provide that, it's a little bit easier to control the ball. Yeah, I agree with you there.
Are there any restrictions with some of the rules, though, anywhere on the court? I noticed that there's a different line sort of towards the back, towards the service line. There seems to be a double line there with the separation. Is there any difference between versions? I was reading that the East Coast version of pop tennis is a lot different than the West Coast version. Have they unified that, Thatcher?
I don't believe there's unification there yet, but I know that in the East Coast, because it gets so cold, they play something called platform tennis, which I think is the same scoring, everything, except you play off the walls too. So if the ball hits the wall, you can keep it in play, and it bounces off all that.
It's arena football for tennis. Is that what you're telling me?
What's that?
It's arena football for tennis. Is that what you're
saying?
Kind
of, yeah, kind of like that. And then they play on these platforms because they're heated underneath. So,
well, what's that double line in the back?
So the double line, it's just, think about a tennis court, right? You've got the service boxes, and then behind the service boxes is the rest of the court. So it's just a really big service box. Your first serve, when you serve underhand, it has to land within that first box, not the back 3 feet. So that 3 feet it's very easy to create these pop tennis courts using pickleball courts. You just add that 3-foot extension on the court, and that becomes your baseline. And then the rest of the pickleball court is where you would serve the ball into.
And we'll get into the specifics of pickleball, because I have a feeling that, though much more widely participated in and a little bit more popular than pop tennis, I think a lot of people still don't know what pickleball is. But there's no kitchen line, correct?
No kitchen. Yeah, you can. You actually want to get right up to that net and put those volleys away. It's a huge advantage because of the size of the court. The lobbing, you still need to lob when people are right up on that net, but it's not as big of a weapon in the game. It's more defensive. You'll push people back with your lobs to get them away from that net. So attacking that net is huge.
So I have to ask the question, Thatcher, your evolution from tennis, then to pickleball, and now to pop, is that sort of follow the same kind of popularity in these racket sports, that tennis is still the top dog and probably will be for a while? Pickleball is a fast-growing, the claim of it, the fastest-growing sport in the world, but whether that's true or not, that's hard to define. And now you kind of have pop tennis, which has been around for a lot longer than pickleball, but it's not nearly as participated or as popular. Is that kind of – so why did you go from – are you sort of devolving in popularity there?
I think so. Pickleball was a fun game to – keep the racket sport skills up with, and it was competitive. It was fun. But I was down at Venice Beach with my wife, and we were at the beach surfing, and I saw the courts there. It's extremely popular at Venice Beach. And I was watching them play, and I just thought it looked so much fun. It's very fast paced. You know, pickleball, you have that dink game that we never enjoyed at first, right? We thought that was kind of ridiculous.
Because you hate small game, Thatcher.
I hate the
everything's
game.
a power shot for you.
Yes, and so you can hit these huge forehands, come in and put a slam away. So it's a lot of fun. But I agree with you. I think pickleball courts, for some, I don't know when that popularity just exploded, but they did a good job creating the courts on all, tennis courts, whereas pop tennis just wasn't, I guess, as creative in that, getting out to more areas.
So let's define pickleball real quick. And for the purpose of this, I'll just, since I'm much more familiar with, not more than you, but I am more familiar than I am than pop tennis. The biggest difference is I still think it's a smaller court, right? That 3 feet miniaturizes it a little bit, right?
Sure.
And pickleball also has what we call the no volley zone, or the kitchen. And
Right.
there's a line that's 7 feet on both sides of the net where you're not allowed to cross unless it bounces. And I think that's a huge change in the game from pop, or certainly from tennis, because it creates this space that you're just not allowed to play on. Obviously, the other big differences are the type of paddle and the type of ball, right? Generally it's a hard wiffle ball, which some people think, doesn't move. But Thatcher, we've gotten that thing up pretty hard and pretty fast. And then the paddle, it's not quite a ping pong paddle, but it's more along the lines. Your pop tennis paddle has holes in it, right?
Yeah.
Why?
Yes. So you can swing, and the air won't slow it down.
Like a tennis paddle or tennis racket.
Yes.
But it must be much
Sure.
larger than a pickleball paddle, then, yes?
Yes, it is. So I'm showing them up right now. But here's the pickleball paddle.
It's not much bigger than.
Not much bigger, but yeah, it's definitely thicker, right? And has more weight to it.
And is
More
that
power.
because of the ball, then, would you say? The ball plays a big part in that?
Sure. Yeah, you've got to hit that ball. It's a heavier ball, so.
Yeah.
Well, one difference too, you were talking about the differences between it, and it goes back actually to a story, Kenny, and I'll just dive quickly into it, of a story when we were in Australia, and you were talking about driving on the other side of the road, and you had to drive us kind of all over the country when we were traveling with the basketball team. And you turned to me at one point, and you were frustrated because there's all these roundabouts and they drive on the other side of the road. And you said, did they do this just to be different? And you were frustrated. Well, my kind of issue with pickleball, and something that I'm learning as kind of a novice pickleball player, someone that, just got his racket and all my equipment within like the last month of joining a country club and being able to play a little bit more with you, is why does pickleball do the scoring different than tennis? Is it just to be different than tennis? Because what I like about pop tennis is if you've played tennis before, the scoring is pretty easy to pick up, where the scoring in pickleball is different. Did they do it just to be different, or is there some reasoning behind that?
Well, the history of that is more about how the game was created versus any specific reason. Here's what I do think is very true, and Thatcher, jump in there if I'm sort of misquoting or if I've just got it wrong. But one of the reasons why you have to score when you're serving, right, is the advantage that it would have. And it's the same reason as to why you aren't allowed to just rush the kitchen line right away. So they really want to put an emphasis on the fact that, the receiving team is already at somewhat of an advantage because they already have the kitchen line dominated from the outset. And so it makes it harder to score, I think. Now, why did they do that? That's a great question, I suppose. Maybe there's an answer to that. I think in terms of some of the specific rules to that, I think they're addressed by, again, having it so that the serving team has to let it bounce on the return. and doesn't allow them to just rush the net. And there is no rushing the net. There's rushing the pickleball line. One of the other things too is that I believe, Thatcher, pop tennis, the net is closer in height than to a regular tennis, right? And less than a pickleball, or is it the same as pickleball?
Well, I think it depends. There's different courts, but the main courts we have in California and what they play down in Venice Beach, it's lower. It's 31 inches all the way across. Whereas I think pickleball is 34 inches in the center, and then 36 inches at the posts.
Right.
So it's lower. We play on hybrid courts, and you're seeing a lot of these hybrid courts, pickleball, pop tennis courts. So we use the same nets here as pickleball. So we have to hit a little bit more topspin on our shots. But when you go down in Venice, it's just, really low nets. You can step over them even.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I was just going to say that, playing to 11, which is a typical pickleball game, scoring only when you serve. I think it's, again, mostly how the game was just kind of invented in somebody's backyard versus any one specific reason. I tend to think that, the games are longer in pickleball, right? Because of that, because of the scoring system. But then you play less games. So I don't know in terms of, do you guys typically play a set in pop tennis, at least one set?
One set, yeah. So,
right.
But that's a good question. Like, do you guys know the scoring in badminton, or I don't really know how they score in badminton. So, because it seems like pickleball, they would have been players of some type of racket sport, right?
Right. And again, pickleball has the same dimensions as a badminton court, but that's about all they share.
Right.
Other than it's kind of a racket sport too. These are good questions. I think the games are radically different for a couple of reasons that we've already mentioned. And while I have no experience at all with pop tennis, I can see the attraction for tennis players to kind of actually either start in pop tennis and then move on to tennis, or age out of tennis and move back to pop tennis. And I only say that because I know Thatcher. And one of the things I know about you, Thatcher, is that you really do enjoy the aspects of hitting a forehand smash and really using your power, which is a little less, although it's changing, I think, in pickleball, but it's certainly a little less in pickleball.
Right, yeah. Although I've seen some players now in pickleball that all they do is just hit those power shots. And
right.
Yeah.
Well, it's an interesting, philosophy, because when we first started a few years ago, and I think this held true, it was all about what's called the third shot drop, which is when you're serving, that's the first shot, the return is the second shot, and then as the third shot serving, right, your opponents are already at the kitchen line. And so you want to drop it in front of them so that you have an ability to get to the kitchen line, right? Well, that's kind of changing now. People are really deciding that, at least the good players, that if I hit one super hard, at best they're going to be able to block it, but that's still going to give me the chance to move to the kitchen line. And so the power part, I think, is starting to really almost take over the strategy of pickleball. I personally, since I'm not as good with my forehand, I personally like the idea of getting into a deep game, which I spent a lot of time trying to become better at. But I'm noticing, even at my level, which is only a 4.0, that the better players are power.
I'm a big fan, because I was a guy that liked to play at the net in tennis. I'm a big fan of, just in my early pickleball career, or just hobby, I guess, is just blasting it at people. And like Kenny said, I know that's not maybe the smartest strategy, and there's a lot of times where I hit it and it just goes, way out or way past the line in the back. But, I think that's something that as I'm evolving as a player, and maybe why through this conversation, I think I'm going to be interested in picking up some pop tennis, because it has a lot of those qualities where, as someone that liked to play at the net and kind of, be ready to return back, and anything lobbed up in the air that can smash down on somebody. Those are things I do like in pickleball, but I know there's only a certain extent that you can do it and be successful.
Right. Yeah. And we even, when we started playing, you know, some of the players would get angry when we would smash the ball at them and keep playing like that. But yeah.
Yeah, and that's why.
Suck it up. Suck it up. I'm going to hit it right at you.
That's why I like pop tennis.
Well, I want to kind of get into this a little bit because one of the things about pickleball and its popularity and its core players, you actually find the core players in pickleball to be of an older age set. It's super popular with people 55 and over. Like the vast majority of the 3.6 million players in America who are core players of pickleball, the vast majority of them are over the age of 55. Now, I don't know if that's in part because of the retirement age or if it's just the way the sport has kind of been set up. But obviously, the older you get, the less agile you get. And I played against some really agile 55-year-olds, so I'm not blanket statement here. But, you know, less agile, less responsive, less reflexive, right? And so now when you start blasting a 60-year-old person at the kitchen line, yeah, they tend not to really like that. And and that's why you kind of start to see what happens. And I think it's in any sport. I imagine that your pop tennis is the same way. Tennis is the same way, right? You know, you're not going to play. It's a skill set, right? So if you're pretty good and you're playing against somebody who's not so good, that person's going to get blasted one way or the other, whichever sport it is.
And that was kind of my introduction to pickleball. Was you had told me, you know, you were playing in some tournaments. It was last spring, and I was like, I don't really even know what pickleball is. And I went to Hawaii with my girlfriend, and at our hotel they had, you know, 5 or 6 pickleball courts. They had, you know, 5 or 6 tennis courts too. And everyone I saw out there was like these kind of older people, just kind of, and maybe it was just a leisure, you know, I'm on vacation, I'm in Hawaii type of thing. And I was like, are these the people that Kenny's playing against? Like these kind of old people just lobbing it back and forth. And then I went and looked at pickleball a little bit more and see that, you know, when you get to that 4-0, you know, level or above that, you know, it is this very agile, you know, sport where you have strategy and you have, you know, different types of shots that you're hitting. But I think a lot of people look at pickleball and maybe even pop tennis like they do tennis, where it's kind of an older person's game or a leisure activity, but there's huge variation in that as well.
And make no mistake that there are, you know, we have age divisions and all this too, right? And so there is a 70 plus, I think there's even an 80 plus 5.0 division in pickleball. Now, is that 80-year-old 5.0 player going to be able to compete with a 4 or 5 player at the 35 level? Probably not. I think that it starts to get a little murky. But make no mistake that there are, you know, there's 2 ways to kind of look at how we rate in pickleball. And that leads me to my other question. Do you guys have the same ratings in pop tennis?
Yeah, no, I was surprised that my buddy Noel and we did one tournament, the U.S. Open down in Venice Beach, and all they had was Pro Division and A Division. That's it. So we played in A, but I mean, we're still playing guys who play down there every day. Yeah, so we got smoked. That was our first time. But yeah, that's all they have is kind of amateur and pro.
Yeah, and that leads me to the other thing. And again, we're going to get into our debate, and it's probably going to come out pretty clear, you know, since I'm much more attuned to pickleball, and I've never really played pop tennis. But Thatcher, you've obviously played all 3. And we'll leave some of this to the debate, but some other things that I would say are a little bit different and probably contribute to the popularity of the sports is some of that. There are no ratings in pop tennis, right? I would also say that who are the big stars? And while I don't think the general public is going to recognize any of the pickleball stars, we do have them. We do have the Ben Johns and the Tyson McGuffins and the Kyle Yates and the Simone Jardines and the Irina Taranchenko's. We have those people. Do you guys have those in pop tennis, or are they sort of cult figures, East Coast, West Coast guys, Venice Beach guys? I mean, it seems to me like it's a little less organized on the pop tennis side.
I agree. I think you're going to find a lot of former college tennis players in pop tennis, even when you go down to Venice Beach. I think almost all the regulars out there are former college players. Even the older guys, they're super competitive, man. You see guys trash talking left and right out there. They know each other. There are the Dorner brothers, who have won like almost every professional doubles tournament for the past, I don't know how many years, maybe 10, 15 years. And they're these Australian brothers who played, I think, at Pepperdine collegiate tennis, right? So they're Division I tennis players, probably doubles experts their whole life. So you do have same type of pros. And actually, there are a lot of pickleball pros who play pop tennis as well down there. Yeah, I've seen them.
I just get the sense, though, that pickleball is a lot more popular. I couldn't find any hard numbers on your participation rate. So I don't. Yeah. So I don't know how to make a comparison there. Here's what I get at is that I think pop tennis has a better name than pickleball.
Yeah.
So I think that branding part of it is actually better than pickleball. And I'll sit here and tell you all day long that pickleball, one of the worst things that it has going for them is its name, because people have no idea why it's called that. Right. How does it relate to the actual game itself?
Why is it called that? Do you know?
Yeah, there's a kind of an oral history of this, and it was invented up in Seattle in the mid '60s. There's two stories, and I think they can be incorporated into one story. You got the wife of one of the guys that was the co-creator, and she claims that it reminds her of the pickle boat in rowing, which is kind of made up of a hodgepodge of different oars and throwaway oarsmen. And so I guess it's called the pickle boat. And so pickleball being this combination of all these different sports. But the real story is that their dog was named Pickles. And they just named it after the dog, which is kind of the stupider story. Like, at least the pickle rowing, the idea of somehow pickling is this combination of things, that at least makes kind of sense to me. Naming it after your dog, it could have been just named Rex Ball or Fido Ball or something stupid like that. So I don't really enjoy that aspect of it. And I just think that it's too cute. It sounds like a little kid's game. So I don't. Pop tennis kind of has not only like it's popular tennis, but it's pop tennis. Like, wham, we hit it with pop. And so I like the branding of that. But I do think I would argue all day long that pickleball is just a bigger of the two sports. It has bigger stars. I don't know about pro circuits money-wise, but I would argue there's probably more money in pickleball. And then internationally, I don't think either one of them is huge outside of North America, but I would guess that pickleball is still a little bit bigger internationally. But here's where I think pop tennis, and Thatcher jump in here, has a real opportunity, because it is a little bit closer to tennis.
Yep. Yeah, and I came on and I told you I'm one of the top pop tennis players north of the Grapevine, right? Well, part of that is I don't know that there are any pop tennis courts outside of Venice Beach and Santa Monica. There are a couple of private clubs there that have pop tennis as well. And I guess that some people have private courts in their homes, I've heard. But here in California, West Coast, that seems to be the only place that it's played regularly. And then we've got Bakersfield, which I think is the second largest community outside of LA. And then you've got the East Coast, right? But other than that, I don't think it's played much anywhere. So I agree with you. Pickleball's sort of popped up everywhere. Yeah.
Well, and here's my other argument. So I guess let's get into this, okay? And you can make as many, and again, I'm going to defer a lot more on the skill set part of it, because you are somebody that spent most of his life playing tennis, was a very good high school tennis player, coached it, and then has gotten into you were my first pickleball partner. We only played in one real big tournament and didn't do very well. And but you were kind of my originator in pickleball, and now you're a pretty big pop tennis guy. So you have experience in all three. But let's jump into this debate. give me your rationale as to why pop tennis is the better of the two sports, Thatcher.
Okay, well, it's fast-paced. It's action-packed. There's trash talk. There's no crying, like in pickleball, about hard shots. You better be able to take it. And it translates, if you're a tennis player, it's so easy to jump into, right? And that's part of the thing about tennis, too. Like, I can't go out and play tennis right now and enjoy it. My timing will be horrible, and it's really hard to keep that up. So pop tennis is really easy to jump into if you've played tennis. And no rules, new rules to learn. So I think the fast-paced aspect, you can keep you're developing the double strategy in tennis. It's the same game, just on a smaller court, and it's powerful. It's exciting.
I got to ask the question, do you guys do much singles in pop tennis, or doesn't exist?
It's sort of like pickleball, right? It's not as popular. You would like it, actually, because the singles is actually a lot like pickleball. You cannot serve and volley. I don't know why that is in pop tennis, but you can't serve and volley in singles. In doubles, you can, but not in singles. So it's similar to pickleball in that aspect. So
here's going to be my rationale for pickleball. Okay. Obviously, as I stated before, it's a much bigger sport, both in popularity and in organization. I think one of the things pop tennis doesn't have, as I said, is it's not unified. You got East Coast and West Coast. You don't have very many participations north of Venice Beach in California, which is crazy to me. Does it even exist in the Midwest? That's a great question, right? So from an organization and a popularity, I think pickleball is a far superior game in that regard. I'm not talking about the playing of it. I'm just talking about the sport. I also think that pickleball, as I said, has a much bigger names and stars, in part maybe because of its popularity and its organization. I do like the fact that, and I agree with you, singles aren't as big, at least in terms of participation, because the vast majority of pickleball players are older, so they don't want to play singles, they want to play doubles. But you do see at the younger level, singles is a big deal. And on the pro circuit, it's a huge deal. And, that's a great pickleball debate, because I think I play both. I used to, in fact, Thatcher and I, we only played singles for the longest time. It'd be him and I after work. We'd go play pickleball, but it'd just be him and I. And then we kind of met the club and started playing doubles a lot more. Initially, I was all about singles. Yeah. Now it's like completely opposite. Like, I rarely play. I don't enjoy it as much. It's just too much to cover, and I prefer to be a little, I guess, less active in that regard. But I think it's a big deal in pickleball. So I think the game in that regard is a little different than pop tennis. Now, maybe pop tennis will get there. The small court is huge, and the conversion of of pickleball from a tennis court, you can stick upwards of 4 pickleball courts on one tennis court. How many can you do that with? Can you do the same?
I don't know. I honestly don't know. I would imagine you probably could, but see, you run into the fences, right? So it's that extra 6 feet. You're starting to run into the fences that surround the tennis courts. Even at our club, right? We don't have much room to, back up and hit a deep shot. So that becomes a problem with pop tennis.
Right.
So I would imagine no. You could.
Right.
I would think 2 courts.
So that accessibility to me is bigger in pickleball, because you can put more pickleball on it. Here's the other part that I would say elevates pickleball over pop tennis currently. And again, none of this has to do with the playing of it, because one, I can't speak to the playing of pop tennis and never played it. No. 2, I would defer to you and knowing why you like pop tennis. I saw it in your pickleball game. So I'm not debating whether the sport playing is better, but just in terms of why pickleball is bigger. And one of the other reasons is that it is such a social game. I don't know the social aspects of pop tennis. In pickleball, since you have so many people kind of on these courts all at the same time, you get a lot more like social contact, talking. We are Is there an age group with pop tennis? Do you see a lot of 50 and 60-year-olds playing it? I'm sure there are some.
You know, you see some older guys down in Venice, but you make a good point. They're regulars, right? You have these regular groups, and it isn't like pickleball where if you go to a new area, right, they'll say, hey, who are you? Come on, jump on in. They don't do that there. You've got to put your paddle up. You've got to ask them, you know, hey, can I play a game with you guys? Usually they're pretty nice, but yeah, it isn't welcoming like the pickleball communities. I agree with that.
And then the final thing, well, the two final things I'll just say is that I do think that pickleball is probably less demanding because it can be played at sort of these different levels. You aren't smashing it all the time, right? And so I think that's more welcoming. And then I also think the kitchen line is kind of an equalizer. I got to imagine that in pop tennis, there's a certain skill set that is just hard to overcome. It's smashing the ball or whatever. But I think in pickleball, you can kind of overcome that by getting into that dink game, getting into the short game. And I'm not obviously an expert about pop tennis, but I think the kitchen line becomes more of an equalizer, makes it a little, I don't want to say accessible, but a little easier to compete if you're not 6'4", have a huge wingspan, and know how to hit 110-mile-an-hour forehand.
Right, and that's a good point. Yeah, I agree with that 100% because you see the Dorner brothers who have won these tournaments. They are like 6'4" or something tennis players, right? And so they have that huge advantage. It's hard to lob them. They can get right up on the net. Yeah, so they can cover the court really easily.
The final thing I'm going to say, though, is as I made mention, the two cons with pickleball. Number one, stupid name. But I think the biggest con, and there's really not much you can do about it, and this is what really generates a lot of controversy, is it's loud. Does pop tennis have more of a tennis sound to it? Because with pickleball, in communities where there are tennis courts, you find the neighbors getting so upset because they complain about how loud it is. And it's hard to contend with. I think most of these neighbors are really out of their mind about these kind of things.
I think it's so stupid because I remember that being an issue here. Since I've started playing pickleball, yeah, you get the paddle back and forth. It's not like it's a freaking earthquake coming through your town or a rock concert. Right. The fact that that's a deterrent for pickleball, I think that is absurd. I just don't understand that. I think people need to like reevaluate their lives and put things in perspective a little bit more. That, you know, the sound of a paddle going back and forth for an hour or whatever, you should be able to overcome that. We should have a little more mental fortitude in our lives, and some of those people that, you know, were up in arms at the city hall about pickleball need to chill out, because it's something where, you know, just listening to you guys talk about it and trying to say, you know, which one would I be more interested in? And I have invested some money in pickleball, and, you know, hopefully Kenny and I get to go out this weekend or sometime soon once, you know, the smoke is clearing from around here, and get to go hit the ball again and be active. But I think with both of them, what you have is that opportunity to play a version of a racket sport that is more accessible and that people should be more open to than where we're at right now.
I remember that happening in Pacific Grove. I was there at the time when they were starting to build the pickleball courts on the tennis center there, right? And and I agree. It's like I was telling Kenny, I was saying, you know, these courts aren't being used. You know, it's nice seeing people. If I lived around there, it'd be nice seeing families using these courts, you know, getting together. I think that's a great thing for the community. Kids able to play something, right? So I agree with you there. I was going to say one thing about pop tennis. One of the negatives is, and probably why it's not as popular as pickleball, is the tennis community has a hard time opening up to new ideas, right? Mm-hmm. I think that you saw it with pickleball, right? They didn't want to share these areas with pickleball. And we actually ran into that here with the pickleball community, because we were chalking the 3-foot lines onto the pickleball courts, and they weren't happy with us, but the parks department gave us the okay. They were fine with it. And I agree, you know, it's that tennis community had the opportunity USTA went around telling clubs, hey, we can draw these lines for pop tennis for youth developmental games onto your courts, and they didn't take them up on it. And so that's why we don't see as many pop tennis courts as you do pickleball. Yep.
I certainly don't want to stir any controversy. I mean, I kind of like doing that, but I'm not going to go too far. I echo all those sentiments. I think what's interesting or funny has been for these 3 years is that they're all of these are racket sports, and they all kind of complement each other. And I get the idea of tennis being the top dog, and anybody who plays tennis saying, wow, I had all this availability because these courts are here and built for me. And yeah, maybe not as many people are playing tennis, but whenever I want to play, it's available. Wait a second, what's going on here? Who are these people? Why are they kind of coming into my territory? But to me, that's just such a selfish attitude. And I almost wish there was a unifying body for all these racket sports in some way to say, hey, like, we need to all be kind of supporting each other. I just find the bickering over accessibility and sound and, you know, how big each of the courts are and what's the difference. It takes it away from the enjoyment of it. Yeah. And again, my whole thought on, if you live next to a tennis court, you chose that.
Yep.
I can't see any other way around it. If you bought it because you thought tennis was dying and you thought it was just going to be this empty court, then too bad that somebody's come along and said, hey, it's a public community thing. I just don't see a counter argument to that.
I'll stir the pot, because I know you went through this a little bit, Kenny, when the high school was thinking about putting in lines and when the community was. Tennis community, as someone who had a grandfather who passed away but played tennis, he was a football coach but played tennis up until literally the week before he passed away. Be more inclusive to things like pop tennis. Be more inclusive to things like pickleball, because what it's going to ultimately do is expand the reach of racket sports. I don't think, even with pickleball being, you know, one of the fastest growing sports in America, in the world, whatever it is, tennis is still going to be at the forefront. There still is, you know, the professional tennis organization is still going to be the one that draws the attention, that has the Wimbledons, that has the French Opens, that has that worldwide appeal. But the sport is going to continue to shrink if you're not more inclusive. I think we see that in so many aspects of our life, that if you are shutting off, if you're narrowing who can come in and who can be a part of what you have, is those things are going to just keep dying. And tennis is going to keep shrinking, and the courts are going to remain open, are going to remain empty because people just don't want to do it. Because you're right, you can go down to Goodwill down the street and get a tennis racket for $5. It's not like golf where you have to invest a lot of money and have like the equipment to be successful. You can go out and buy, you know, 2 tennis rackets for $10 at Goodwill and go out and play and have a good time. I think it's a sport that you can play forever, that you can play until you're 80, 90 years old. I think pickleball and pop tennis are in that same realm. And I really think that those communities have to be more inclusive, that we have to open those up. And I love the idea of pop tennis being a transition for younger people into tennis and learning those skills, learning those strokes, learning how to count score. And then you can say, hey, if I really like this, I can go play tennis. Because I think Kenny talked about this at the beginning. It's that perception of like, tennis is hard, tennis is tiring, it's difficult, and I don't have the opportunity to play. And the reality is you do have the opportunity to play.
Yep.
Yeah, and I mean, and it goes both ways too. Like, I think both pickleball and pop are great introductory sports to tennis. But then I also think they're great graduation when you start to graduate out of tennis and you're like, man, it's just too much. Even in doubles, it's just too much of running around. It's too punishing on me. So now you can sort of evolve, seeing 70 and 80, and I've seen this, even a 90-year-old play pickleball. How do you criticize that? How do you look at that and say that shouldn't be supported? Because I can tell you, and Thatcher, again, I know you'll back me up, part about adult education is it's not so much necessarily about what you learn. It's just that you're learning, you're involved, you're active, whether that's in a physical sense, which I think pickleball is and pop tennis can be, or whether that's just mentally, I'm communicating and I'm out there amongst other people. This is how you stay alive and you stay out of the hospital and out of the nursing homes and out of getting killed by COVID. You're healthy, you play sports. Pickleball and pop, to me, and golf are three things that I would argue you can do when you're 70 years old.
Yeah, I completely agree. And like we said, tennis is dying out. They've got to come up with something because it's not working, right? Like the tennis courts I grew up on, they were great. These public parks, tennis courts, Roding Park in Fresno, and they're not used anymore. Like there are probably 20 courts there that are rarely used, and they're beautiful tennis courts, great facility. So get some different games out there that people will come and play. Yeah.
Well, Thatcher, I want to thank you. We're going to wrap this sucker up. Great talk there. Unfortunately, you lost the debate. Pickleball is the better sport of the two. So until you guys organize better, you're just going to have to suffer as our stepchild. We'll be the stepchild to tennis. You can be the stepchild to us. I'm kid, of course. But Thatcher, I do want to I want to thank you for coming on. I enjoyed the conversation. Look forward to some more maybe pop tennis, maybe pickleball, but also maybe some educational podcasts in the future. We'd like you to come on and talk 2 cents, especially maybe in the realm of ESL and how adult education is really something to be supported, certainly in California, but nationwide.
Yep. Sounds good, buddy. It was great to be on here, both of you, Bo and KO. I had a great time, great debate. I would disagree with you on the outcome of the debate, but we'll have to get out on the, what we'll have to do? We'll have to get out on the pickleball court and the pop tennis court and figure this out.
Let's do it.
Yeah.
Thatcher, I'm still nursing my nearly severed ankle injury from May 1st and have not played pickleball very much lately. I will, this is where some truth will come out. I have to admittedly say that Thatcher is still the better racket sport player. But since he doesn't play pickleball anymore, I've got the gold. I've got the actual title. I don't know what you have, pal. Don't hold it up. That means nothing to me. What did you do at the US Open for pop tennis?
You know what? I learned the game, and I'm going to be ready next time. So.
Okay.
We'll be ready.
I will gladly accept your challenge of playing pop tennis, though.
Sounds good.
Ready.
When I come to Bakersfield, have a racket for me. We'll get out there. You probably think I'll be terrible. I probably won't be as terrible as you think I am.
Sounds good.
My only goal in life during the rest of this COVID, besides teaching my classes and doing this podcast with Kenny, is that I'm going to become the next Ben Johns of pickleball in the Monterey Peninsula. So I'll just be whooping on everybody and use my tennis background to become a better pickleball player.
Sounds good. I can't wait to see it.
Yeah. No, this was fun. Appreciate you guys for being on here. And I'm Bo.
And I'm KO.
That's the show. We'll